Hello everyone, today we talk about the warfare of a series of peoples inhabiting the space between the Baltic and the Volga, of in fact Baltic, Slavic, Finnic ethnicity, and sometimes they were mixed to the point of, say, at least difficult recognition, more or less in the same century, say the 10th, the 11th, or around this time. To the previous video of the series, which this video also belongs, of Eurasian steppes warfare. Right, today we talked mostly about the world of the forest, but as you know from the previous episodes, I decided to include some essentially sedentary people. Some of these were, to a degree, if not semi-nomadic, at least, on the move, right, transhumant, at least, habituated to scatter, also on a larger territory in case of emergency, of threat. We're talking about, again, very obscure places historically, because we know a few about them, and that had been only partially touched by civilization. As we've seen, the major power rising at this point in the area of Eastern Europe was the Kievan Rus, that in fact was dreaded by these peoples living at the outskirts, because they didn't have so much to oppose to it, right? Different people. Some were, also allies with the Rus, alternatively or intermittently. The picture was very, very complex, and I hope to come back on each one of these populations in dedicated videos, as, for example, the ones I do on the historical region series, because today we will kind of mesh them a bit together up for the sake of simplicity. Naturally, their warfare was somehow similar. The space is big, right? But it's also not particularly diversified. All these populations are importantly influenced by the steppes, right? We've seen it also in the previous one about the Varangians, about the Vikings, that of course even up to Scandinavian and beyond was a steppes influence historically for quite a long time. And say mounted combat, sabers, hit and run tactics, raids were something that these peoples were habituated to, if anything, because they had to defend themselves from the same, and that were quite recurrent, just even in their method of war. Again, today we will not make a scientific list of all the different political, military, social characteristics of every single of these entities, but we can draw from at least the major ones some general conclusion, stereotyping a bit their panoply, etc. So we will look at this time from the 9th to the 11th centuries, right? At the moment, exactly the formation of the Rus, the Viking presence, still the Khazars around. We have seen also in the previous episodes the importance of the Volga Bulgars that are just bordering, especially the Mordovians, we will see now, in the east, in between the Volga and the Dnieper, the Kievan Dominion. I made a video about the Volga Bulgars, for example, so if you're interested to focus more on that side, there is that. We'll come back hopefully on that too again. The spaces are north, west, and east of the middle Dnieper and the Ladoga area. So pretty, as you understand, in the north of the steppe, in the very north of the steppe, at the beginning of the forest area, right? Wild, sparsely populated, heavily forested, marshy, cold areas, right? That, however, have their own movement, have their own limited but relevant resources, and that in fact are looked upon with some greed by the greater powers in the surrounding, if anything, as client state, right, that could provide with fur, timber, slaves, most importantly. A lot of human trafficking, as you know, during the Viking era, along these intercontinental routes, and brutal warfare, right? Tribal, mostly in nature, and naturally influenced by the environment. Some of these peoples were Slavic, right? But there were Balts, Finns, right? So a melange of the same that we know, for example, today with a specific, these are, I don't know, just Baltic or they're Slavic, whatever, but actually they were a superimposition of all these groups at some point, right? Naturally, many changed dramatically later on during Tsarist times, the Soviet Union, to the point of non-recognition, because God knows what the hell happened between deportations, genocides, famines, and so on. So sometimes what we see as, this traditional, beautiful traditional pictures with this abortion of the dignity of mankind, of sickle and hammer on it, is quite disturbing, right? It makes you understand the scale of, traditional destruction that was operated by one of the single most disgusting events in the history of mankind. But we can track something about them still from those times. We will see it better also in the next episodes, because at least these peoples were sedentary by some degree, and there was an important continuity. But as far as the nomads, very often we just say, this people is just that one with that Turkic name. Do we know whether they have anything to do with them? No, right? Because everything is gone lost, right? In terms of actual, migrated. It's not just, it's also the Mongol invasion. It's a lot of things actually troubling these regions. But anyway, we start from the westernmost ones. The most famous, we've seen videos about them: the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians. Just the other day we were talking about medieval Finland. We've seen the Karelians, these people fundamentally in between the Swedish-dominated Finnic space and the one eventually in which the Republic of Novgorod would expand in. Across again, significant amount of spaces, north of which there was basically just wilderness, by the way, and the same peoples kind of went on for hunting parties, literally hunting people there. For slaves and more, but being able to unleash these ferocious guerrillas incursions raid on the base of a proxy prompt, let's say, from the side of the Swedes or of the Rus, and it's really fascinating. Then, if we look at other areas, there are the Vepsians, essentially southeast inland continentally of the Scandinavian peninsula. On the far west, on the Baltic, we have fundamentally within the boundaries dominated by the PS, famously enough, that were affirming their princely and actually royal power in Poland. The Prussians, the old Prussians, the old people that was wiped out, at least politically, by the Teutonic knights. The Mari, that were a bit further southeast of the Vepsians, actually between beyond the Moravians and the Permians, the frontier in between. The Mordovians that we were mentioning before, essentially south of the Mari, west of the Volga Bulgars, essentially just north of the northernmost part of the Kazan Empire, from the right, on the right bank of the Volga, geographically, and therefore, quite distinct. Again, there are groups, the Mesh Karen, we'll see partly on the Murom, the Permians, the Kuts, etc. It's not easy, right, just even to characterize, and that's where we will make a bit of a group, right? Some, and especially the latter, right, the latter peoples from the side of in the East conserve their primitive way of life. Right, for example, the Valdians, the Zorians, the Kurshans. These are in the northwest, in Estonia, towards the east, up to the Neva River, etc. So these are some, in fact, what will remain, also we see during the Baltic Crusade, the Estonian auxiliaries, right, very primitive, mostly infantry-based, without essentially in literally much else, even in terms of armor. And this leading to also some interesting tactical balance with the, with Teutonic Knights essentially covering their flanks, right, as infantry wings, as the Livonian Chronicle says at some point, but this is slightly later in time. Today we talk about properly the High Middle Ages, some much more hardcore as far as this tribal brutality is concerned. Some were assimilated by the Slavs at this point. For example, the Marians, the Moromians, the Mescarians, a part of the same Bepsians. And there was surely a Finnic substratum. There were other previous influences, Iranian ones, etc. So it's even very complex just for the size of these peoples to determine that. It's worth noting anyway that the fate of an ethnos depended on not just their political cohesion, but as a consequence on their military equipment, that by some degree, in spite of the relative material homogeneity, does allow to make some distinction. These were, say, it's not that there was a very high military quality or particular, even properly warlikeness to these populations. Mostly they were so sparse that they had difficulties in putting together forces. But as we have seen, this meant that individually they had to be, in terms of heroic ethos, individualistic skills, etc., some sort of important capacity that was just dictated in many cases by the environment, even without, let's say, foreign threat, right? Aside from the fact that they constantly kill each other in their clanic feuds, etc. But given the political instability, generally speaking, but the idea of living, again, in the High Middle Ages in these areas with the resources available is just something that makes you live in a state of mind for which, like, killing is not even remotely per se just the worst thing that may happen to you to survive. The physical strains were unspeakable. And generally speaking, the resilience of some peoples, even in the face of a much greater onslaught, is remarkable. I made a video about Lithuanian warfare, say the warfare of the Baltic Crusades, and the Baltic tribes, in fact, specifically, would resist, as you know, for centuries, especially the Lithuanians, that were, however, admittedly growing from a certain point onwards, especially after the collapse of the Kievan Rus under the Mongols, this sort of, takeover of Ruthenia that they made. But still, because they had to face the Teutonic Knights in the north, right? So this huge interland extensionally was not enough in insight to do that, so much so that they had to call for Poland, that they had initially raided, right, just as initial enemies that now instead were seen as a common ally against this German presence, and that's how eventually the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in a sense, was established, right? But those were campaigns that lasted repeatedly. I made a video about medieval Lithuania, explaining how in like tens and tens, in a matter of relatively few years, telling you how continuous, relentless their military activity really was, and extremely costly, and at the end of the day, crippling, right? And especially in the case of Lithuania, they basically lost, right? Again, they were saved by the Teutonic Knights, by the Poles, but The reason being that it had literally given way to Poland, right, as such. In any case, by these previous years, the Baltic tribes had created an original as impressive set of weaponry. This included battle knives, so massive sometimes they could be as well called single-edged swords. So massive. This I recall definitely the Saxons of the migration era. They were massive chopping weapons that were in fact ideal in a very poorly armored context, where you couldn't really defend yourself very effectively from cuts, but also just to get across, like, I don't know, very thick woods or things like that. And that could turn out to be useful in many different situations. Interestingly, these as the Saxons were single-edged blades, right? So they were properly conceived mostly for cutting. In part, as we will see also, for mounted combat. It was relatively scarce, but still existed among the local elites. Very important battle axes with a relatively narrow blade, which tells you that also in this case, they could cause significant blunt trauma against an armor, as the one of some of their enemies. Indeed, they were mostly, given that the panoplies are mostly designed for local warfare, so primarily against the same people that uses it, more oriented towards cutting per se. In the case of the Latvians, such axes were reinforced with a bronze band on the handle towards the upper part, suggesting a very shifted balance towards the upper head and the upper hand, and the probably also throwing function of some sort, and a good capacity also mounted use at the same time. So literally smashing from the top or throwing this thing, as we've seen, the Khazars used similar stuff. But this was heavier. This was kind of more impacting, and again, it was surely an effective weapon against some of the most armored opponents that could come to molest these populations. The same goes for spears, javelins, with medium-sized heads of a characteristic shape. This was, as you understand, it's a very typically, you wouldn't even think we are in the High Middle Ages by some degree. It's as if these weapons had remained a bit the same from the migration era. A normal context of antiquity, with the average tribesman from somewhere in Central Eastern Europe just having these javelins, daggers, spears, and barely any armor. But it was quite effective, right? This also was all designed for a more agile type of warrior, hit and run tactics, ambushes, guerrillas, skirmishes. Missing them, these were quite frequent, right? Cavalry and infantry were basically designed to do this. They wouldn't, hold the ground for a longer time against more heavily armored opponents, but they were quite smart, in as much as, for example, enveloping maneuvers were concerned. The reliance, by the way, on local, on even temporary fortifications created with tree logs, right, ambushing the enemies on very tough ground, marshes, streams, forests, all of these places that could really reduce the inferiority, especially compared to what a pitched battle would have offered. Naturally, among one another, they clashed quite consistently in open ground as well, and some of them were admittedly very well armored. When I hear the point is not that they didn't have the technology, or it's just that it cost so much that most of them would find another way. And generally speaking, the military system would work more primitively. But again, considering the surroundings, especially times like the 9th century, it's really normal standard. Nobody wars, right? There isn't yet the 13th century heavily armored guy around to create such problems in the first place. The Lithuanian tribes developed a sword pommel of distinctive shape with 2 volutes, which suggests an increase in kind of maneuverability from even maybe the intervention of the second hand, or at least increasing the need of feeling the entirety of this sword pommel to the point of making more substantial movement with that. This, is not surprising because the Lithuanians were at least rising to be some of the most politically and compact and militarily active groups around. Admittedly, they were all kind of fragmented in different tribes, right? So they actually would take a very long time before they compacted. But let's say for the neighboring average, let's put it in this way, there was a greater proximity to the west. There were some interesting resources to exploit. They were coming under some kind of pressure. They were closer even to the access to certain trade routes, let's say, and so their elites that had a greater emphasis on mounted warfare, some of the northeasternmost ones, probably necessitated this kind of more slightly more evolving types of weapons. However, the Baltic nobility often use imported Scandinavian swords, right? This aspect is important because, as we've seen in turn, these Scandinavians imported Frankish blades to mount them in their homeland. It was cheaper for them. Lithuanians were the living of kind of the influence mostly that from Scandinavia at that point. That truly had a hell of a military culture, and the Baltic elites were, of course, sensitive to that. Let's put it in this way, and say also the Scandinavian, let's say, fighting styles were somehow closer to theirs for this osmosis to work more smoothly, right? Interestingly enough, the Baltic nobility, well, imagine them that quite physically, right? They had, for example, they used big spearheads. Like, the concept is properly causing massive damage, right? Even though there is very few armor around, the concept is that you want to, when you hit, you want to open massive wounds, right, into your enemy's body. Battle axes. So naturally, the elite trains dramatically with all of these weapons that were a bit traditional, right? Also, the average, say, freeman, farmer / raider used, if not necessarily the bigger swords, especially the import ones. However, spears, javelins, battle axes, we've seen that. But maximizing them, having more, maximizing their use, having more resources to train, right, for a longer time, something is starting to happen ever more consistently. There is a bulk of forces mounted ones, armored ones, generally speaking. They lead the raid. They're surrounded by a screen of lighter ones. They coordinate them, whatever. And these ones are really deputed to even engage against such opponents. Again, they killed each other constantly in clanic feuds. It was always the case, and sometimes their worst enemies were not the invading foreigners, but during the same invasions, the same guys that lived next door that took advantage of the situation to raid in their neighbors' territories. This happened again all the time. So again, the necessity of facing another elite warrior was basically what all these guys' armament, equipment, and mindset were all about, right? Baltic warriors seemingly were not very fond of bow and arrows, at least compared to their eastern neighbors, right, to a lesser degree. Again, remember, few armors, so actually arrows flew together with javelins, etc., quite consistently. Just the idea is that these people's armies were so primitive by a degree that they counted mostly on the on the infantry shock force, right? They wouldn't need, especially if you look at it in Estonia. Actually, the Lithuanians were more, as we've seen, diversified tactically, had more cavalry, etc. But seemingly in Estonia, even later on, we're just infantrymen. We're literally nothing else. They're equipped just like that. They could have bows, whatever, but they prefer to get things over. Like it's again a very conventional type of necessity in their land, right? To get it over with, given that resources also to spend for warfare are somehow limited. To settle matter, you go there on foot. You, generally speaking, can't escape as a consequence. So if you have to stand your ground, either you do it successfully or die there, and you help, say, functionalizing the necessity of this feud. So to conclude it as quickly as possible, recompacting the political cohesion of the community, of the tribe. This proclivity towards hand-to-hand combat is interesting because it also increases the general brutality. Right, the Baltic peoples are pretty sturdy race. Right, they are tough. They, as we've seen, were tempered by a vicious environment, to say the least. And so, again, getting cut on a battlefield was really, part of the entire game on a regular basis. The nobles, however, did fight on horseback. Right, again. Here we're never talking about absolutes, even when we do, saying that there was never just infantry. Yet, of course, there were horsemen. Just by approximation, it's as if they had not played much of a great role. However, of course, they did fight on horseback. Seemingly, a horse cult became widespread among the Lithuanians and the Prussians, that were, as we've seen, more influenced by Western warfare. The Polish one, at this point, didn't either consider the Poles had like 1/3 of their army mounted, mostly unarmored forces, but still, quite pressuring for peoples like the Prussians that resisted so much so that the Poles had to call the Germans at that point, and the Lithuanians that, as we said, were habituated to launch significantly long-range raids into Polish territory and in other surrounding countries, and that were taking a taste for that, like finding the resources through loot just to keep kind of perpetuating at least the availability of resources for these raids to continue, because otherwise it would have not carry them out in the first place. The Prussians were a very tough nut to crack. Right? Again, the Piasts couldn't quite do it alone, even though they were an inferior people. The Poles strived against them because they were also consistent. Again, it's very difficult to. This is the case for, let's say, the frontier, generally speaking, to properly eradicate a people from a place. Right? That these may be. Less developed, more, say, unsophisticated, whatever. They have all their political, social problems, but fundamentally they are a population deeply compacted by the necessities of the harvest of the agricultural cycles in those lands. They have been working them, striving against nature for centuries and centuries. They're just not, they're not mentally programmed to do anything else but resisting at all costs and breeding and continuing to fight, and knowing that the harder the hammer, the harder the anvil had to be. So it took finally the Teutonic Knights to literally cancel these people from the face of the earth, At least many of them survived, but as essentially serfs of these new German and Polish lords. But it took also a massive amount of exterminated people in order to achieve that, right? In the famously now. And the Teutonic Knights were not really, people from which you can expect, like, something like understanding, sensitivity, empathy, or things like that. These peoples are designed exclusively to exterminate people, and that's the only thing that they do, right? That's the only thing for which they are actually designed as a military machine. That's the purpose of the religious military orders, the monastic military orders. There's no other purpose whatsoever. And they are pretty damn good at that, right? Civilization spread like crazy thanks to them. Just these places here took, admittedly, a longer time to get started, because there were very few resources locally, and surely these cute say ethnocides were not exactly what helped in the process. Consider that later on they were wiped out, even as they had already in part converted to Christianity and so on. So the problem there was evidently the creation of we've seen it yesterday with, for example, the Swedish colonization of Finland, right? It's just, in fact, a colonial mentality in many ways. So when we look at the Baltic peoples, their weapons were richly adorned with bronze findings, chased, engraved, or incised. So of course they like to show off a little bit if they had any of that wealth that could afford them to do. Sword belts and spears were similarly decorated. That was a huge deal, claiming their status in front of everyone, but still so miserable by comparison to what was happening in other parts of Europe. But again, to them it was really important. The Lithuanians and Prussians created an especially splendid horse harness, telling the truth. Because again, they were a bit obsessed with horses. In all these people's culture, horsemanship was really, really important, especially in the ones from the west, from the European side. There were some of these peoples that were ethnically denominated as literally the ones who have to die. And I remember if they are the Mordovians, because that literally, or another of these groups that literally were designed as the ones who lived at the outskirts of the ones of the peoples that instead ruled, in that case, mostly the steppes. So the traditional awareness of who was above, who was under at the time, was dramatically felt to the point of literally giving internationally recognized and ethnic identitary names to actual people. They understand that these are the ones living in the outskirts of civilization, in the forests, in the dirt. They stay under, and they have to die at the end of the day, because that's their function, as if they were sacrificial victims. Think how impacting that is, because these people knew perfectly well who was there from the other side. The Khazars, the Khivans, and beyond that, the Byzantines and others. They saw the wealth, right? They knew it existed, and they did really feel at the outskirts of civilization. This is an aspect that I always try to convey in my videos, that never think that moral relativism that you have been brainwashed with the idea that every people is the same. They actually think the same about themselves like any other. This is BS. Historically speaking, everybody recognized it was a massive ecumenic empire somewhere. This was the biggest thing, was God's thing. And if you were the outskirts of that, you were less. You were radically complexed. And the only way to fix that was to keep on fighting, just in the first place to survive, but to try to literally transfigure in the hope of at least getting a better place in the universal hierarchy than the one you really had, right? This is very evident in many mythologies. It's not just the environment, the animals species changing. There are actually chthonic animals mostly in the outskirts areas, right? And Apollonian ones in the most developed one. Think about the eagle and the crow, right? Technically, they do say it's like a wolf or a dog or whatever. There is not even just an immediate immediately recognizable racial and kind of archetypal difference in them. They do perform similar roles, but the undertone depends on this kind of psychological awareness of where the people lays in the hierarchy of civilization. So the horse, that's the point with the Lithuanians and the Prussians, was a bit the universal symbol of the warrior, of the hero. That this was, of course, having a horse meant to have land, ruling on other people to maintain yourself. And the horse was like the griffin, like a ambivalent symbol, right? It was the blood, the dirt. The horse is a very physical beast, right? And at the same time, it's so agile and elegant, and it runs, and it brings the night in heaven, right? There are some moments in which the horse flies, technically, while he is galloping. So that is the moment in which you're floating between heaven and hell. And the balance was all what these people thought about. Whilst offensive weapons were abundant, there was practically no defensive armor, as we were saying before. Again, it costs too much. It's difficult sometimes when studying military history to think how, somebody would make up for kind of the lack of safety, of security, going apparently against, like an anti, against the instinct of preservation. Well, that's exactly what war is. That's the other thing with which you have been brainwashed, that of course there are very stupid wars per se, but war is not done instinctively. Wars are done rationally. That is to say, you must want to go against your instinct of survival to do them. So actually, there are some of all the human enterprises, wars, in spite of how they're chosen, led, whatever, fought, are actually one of the single most radically rational process of the entire human civilization history. And when you go to war, the reason is so bigger, right? Especially for these peoples here, that it doesn't matter to have a defensive armor. In war, there is no such thing like, I overload myself in a defense and I hope to make the thing. War is primarily about offending, because that's, as we've seen for the Clausewitzian series, the weaker form of war, admittedly, does expose you more, but the one with the positive effect, right? So the defensive one can last so long as it makes you hopefully gain that advantage that is necessary to counter-offend. And that's all the point that it is. So between the two, especially in a world where war is so self-evident, everybody knows what it is, how it works, and none of the strange mental disease that we suffer of today regarding rational, logical, scientific, moral realities. The offensive dimension was way more important than the defensive one. It was just calculated on the base of costs-benefits ratio. There existed, as the major defensive armor, a local round wooden shield covered with leather or skin. The minimum, though. Right, again, very, very similar weapons all together to the migration era. This shield occasionally, especially with an iron umbo that was per se just relatively rare, right? As you know, it helps deflecting blows, especially where your hand stands. It allows you some extra offensive capacity. You can break somebody's face with that. There are lots of useful things you can do with it. But this is reserved for the elite, mostly. And this just for an iron umbo, that tells you how brutally unavailable most material really is. Only the Lithuanians and Prussians had beautifully evident helmets for still the standards of the times and the places. Again, these guys were somehow closer to civilization. Big word, but compared to whatever laid east, especially in the north, that's kind of the case. In fact, helmets were for the rest among these other populations rare, and still mostly a foreign manufacture, which still means they're mostly for the elites, really, because those are the only guys who can afford to buy stuff that comes from abroad and is kind of above average for the local capacity. So we see even just archaeologically there is a strong influence from the external. We do know, of course, that these peoples would get some of those, and not necessarily from the most updated types either. This is typical, right? You get just even second-hand stuff, older, more, anachronistic models. But hey, it's still an element. Right, it's not that there are so many different types of helmets. That's also what we don't get, because we think that technology is everything, while it's literally nothing, and it's only doctrine that matters as far as technology is concerned. There are not really many ways you can make a shield, right? It's that's it, plank of wood, something on it, like that's it. All, especially at this point. So the arms were protected. At least this was a very popular thing among the Latvians, with thick bronze bracelets, which speaks also of that aforementioned need to engage, to defend yourself in a hand-to-hand combat situation, a close combat situation in which you have few armor, your arms are exposed evidently, and you try to make up for this lack of protection by having literal bracelets as type of armor. Speaking again of the Easterners, we find really something more scarily primitive, right? The Vapsians, the Marians, the Muramians, the Meshkarians had very scanty and archaic weapons. Javelins, small battle axes, sometimes socketed ones, knives, bows, and arrows. That's basically it. But even just heavier type of thing like spears, shields, for these people it becomes that they're used. No doubt the javelin can be easily a spear and vice versa, right? There is not a law that prohibits that. But overall, they're so light, right? They don't need, because their entire societal structures do not even conceive much of a broader political compaction necessary for even gathering enough troops to hold ground as a sort of phalanx, like in open ground, right? It's just about this constant guerrilla. Admittedly, it's vicious. These people, again, are some of the most traumatically violent populations ever existed, right? We think that has to do with how destructive you are. No. It's by far the most civilized peoples who are the most destructive things, also the most destructive ones, and it's a compliment, morally, scientifically, culturally, right? Civilizations are the superior things in the world, not the other way around. The importance is knowing how to handle them, right? And the proof being here that these tribes we listed here were defenseless before the forces of Kiev, right? The Kievans kicked ass. These other peoples were essentially just a constant pain in the behind, because, as we were saying before, you can't even carry out large, long-range devastations, large massacres, deportations, cancel, etc. But you don't have the capacity at the time to literally eradicate these people from the face of the earth, right? You admittedly need them as subjects rather than the desert, right? But the difference in potential, we've seen it the other day when describing a Kievan Russian heavy cavalry panoply is massive, right? It's really a huge divide for the time being. Admittedly, the average Russian would have not been dramatically better equipped, like unless he was like maybe a guy from the militias of the main Russian cities on the great Eastern European rivers that could also get lots of, material surplus from it. The average peasant out there was somehow similar. But that's the point. The Khivans controlled major areas. The various principalities were basically a copy of that. And they prospered, especially at this time. The only exception in this, perhaps because they were so hardly pressed that they, and also influenced and also used as proxies sometimes by other peoples, were the Mordovians, right? Because as we've seen, these are in the easternmost area that we take in consideration today, essentially between the Rus and the Bulgars, the Volga Bulgars. And admittedly, it's also the decentralized position. There is no doubt. Again, the Khivans, the Russians had much greater interest in other places, in Constantinople, in the Khazar Khaganate, and so on. So those were the major targets, in a way. However, there was also this thing that the Slavs had been expanding from the west. So there had been a colonization. Some of these peoples were pushed away. That they also were literally taken over by the invaders. At least they became to lord themselves there. So the various princes of the Rus would support these settlements, this colonization, deforestation, all things that helped, of course, grabbing new land and putting them to good use, right? The Mordovians resisted bravely to the Russian princes. In the late 12th century, only they had to, in the late 12th century, had to withdraw from the lands where eventually the new Novgorod was founded, historically. So those are the areas that are very peripheral if you look at the Rus. Again, the century Skiv, those are by far the Russian Palatinates, by far the most advanced areas that would remain until actually a few hundreds of years ago in the entire Eastern Europe. I made several videos about this. In any case, even when the Mordovians came under the rule of the Golden Horde, their princes were relatively independent. This was true in part also for the Volga Bulgars that, as we've seen, managed to still maintain their own power for a while after it had been significantly crippled by the Mongols. Surely with a lot of intersections in terms of arms and armor. In fact, the Mordovian warriors, surprise, surprise, because of Turkic influence, carried sabers, broadswords, together with battle knives, steppe bows, and arrows, right, with appropriate cases and all. So we're talking about really the influence of the composites of the properly of Turkic warfare altogether. They were a bit more mounted as well, admittedly. They used light battle axes, spears. They had sword belts with metal plates. So the Mordovians had their own kind of space in here, and they managed to keep themselves afloat, right? Looking at this panoply, however, from a comparative point of view, let's realize that it was still somewhat similar to one of the Baltic areas in many ways, right? If you look at the local design of weapons, there are lots of similarities. The Mordovian nobility, for example, like that of the Lithuanians, was mounted, was just said. However, in their case, they preferred lashes to spurs, which was also a bit kind of more primitive, a bit more bit less technically developed. Again, they were influenced by steppes horsemanship, but they were still just second grade compared, in fact, to the steppes warriors. Volga warriors, by the way, like their Baltic counterparts, practically didn't have much of an armor, right? So, aside from the Rus, also the eastern neighbors would take advantage of them in many ways. First, the Bulgars were more powerful, the Khazars, later the Mongols. So, again, we're not talking about a great development in the first place. But the spaces covered here are huge, and there are different landscapes, different resources. So, generally speaking, towards the south, you have greater ones, right? And there is the steppes, that is a different space, as we know, and that works the sense differently from from the forests that follow their more kind of let's say traditional way of war, or more kind of, as we've seen here, almost migration era type of fighting. All these populations would again have different destinies. Some would become absorbed by probably the West, right? Think about the Prussians, the Lithuanians as well. The Lithuanians at a point had not much of an opportunity, actually, but at least a chance to unite themselves with Muscovy, and they did with Poland instead. They remained Easterners in a way, as Eastern Europeans, differently from the Poles. But it was still a big deal to have essentially switched to that direction, right? Others, instead, especially the ones that were invested more directly by the Mongol onslaught, that did arrive, admittedly, probably at the gates of the same Lithuania. So basically everybody east of that, and that weren't particularly developed like the Russians, especially the southern ones, would basically lose great part of their previous outlook in many ways. I mean, these spaces are some of the ones for which even Moscow would rise in a way, and as you know, that was basically the most, the most servile agent of the Mongols, right? And the only reason why it rose, it was basically sponsored by them. And civilization, they weren't really particularly advanced, right? They were at some point just more warlike, but it had been due part to the steppes Mongol model, because the Muscovite arms and armor, notoriously made a video about that years ago, you cannot distinguish a Mongol from that. They are, in part, aside from the part that they are basically sometimes literally the same people, right? Because they married into the Mongol nobility, etc. But the Golden Horde, etc. But they are literally equipped in the same way, and their autocratic Tsarist monarchs are essentially the ones of the Mongols, right? It's not a European thing. It's a completely different reality. And if you wonder where such general cultural underdevelopment, brutality, perennial instability really comes from, it's also from that. So, aside from that, I think we analyze some of the most poignant aspects of this people's military cultures that are really minimal, but just for telling you literally what we're talking about by some degree, we will again come back hopefully on these people, so not dedicated videos. These are just some very compressed, superficial, just say progress information, ABC kind of data, and that belong to a broader to a broader series. For every people, I tend to make like a proper analysis, and also we will see this on another occasion. For today, however, I stop here. I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.